Good evening, everyone. Is everyone doing well tonight? Which one should I use? I think this one's on. Can anyone hear me? Yeah, we hear you. You hear me? Perfect. Okay, so I will just be walking you through a few terms that you may or may not be familiar with. Some of them are pretty straightforward. A few are a little more complicated. So I will be asking if anyone in the audience can give me a definition for these, but it's worth noting in your packets that you received when you came in, there is a sheet somewhere in there that has a list of all the terms that I'll be discussing. If you want to take a few notes, that's perfect. But by the time you get home on the website, all the definitions should be uploaded onto the Penn Museum Classroom site. So to get started, has anyone heard of eugenics? Can anyone give me a definition of eugenics? If you do, just shout it out. I'll try to hear you. Anybody? Yeah.
I'll take a shot.
Okay.
I remember eugenics in terms of race. I remember former President Kennedy's father did eugenics on his daughter for marriage. So it was a time in America, and it had something to do with racism.
Yes, so it definitely has to do with racism, which is why we're talking about it today, and it has to do with reproduction. So, eugenics is the attempt to improve the human species by controlling which individuals can or cannot reproduce. So this is choosing people with so-called beneficial or better traits and making sure that they produce offspring. Whereas if you were thought of to have some negative traits or worse traits, they would keep you from having any children. So it was applied, and it had disastrous social consequences, which I'm sure you could all think of if you had to. So the next are a few biochemical terms. We've all heard of DNA, I'm sure. So can anyone shoot out any sort of information about that? Any definitions? If not, it's pretty straightforward. So it's the genetic information contained in cells, which are the fundamental working units of all organisms. So we're all made up of cells, everything's made up of cells, and so we all have DNA that also has to do with genes. So I found this one a little hard to really pinpoint because it's some of those obvious terms that you can't really find a definition for. So does anyone have a definition for gene for me? And if not, we can. Oh yeah.
Gene is a portion of DNA that holds the code for a specific function in the cell, usually the production of protein.
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly what I had to say. I did well. So yeah, as I said, an arrangement of DNA which produces protein and is the functional unit of heredity, which I'm sure we're familiar with, but we'll get to that term later as well. So if you've heard of genes, you've probably heard of alleles. So can anyone give a definition for that one? If you wanted to, again.
It's the two genes that are for the same function, one maternal and one paternal.
Exactly. So everyone has two copies. It's a particular variant of a gene. So some alleles can produce lighter skin pigmentation where others produce darker skin pigmentation. So you have two, one from your mother and one from your father. And related to this, there's this idea of homozygous. So I'm sure you all know what this is. The prefix homo means same. So that would mean you have two identical copies of the same allele. So in genetic terminology, they would usually be denoted by two big A's or two small A's. And can anyone shout out the opposite of homozygous for me? Perfect. So that's having two different copies of the same allele. So big A, little a. Now genome. I know we've all become familiar with the term genome through the Human Genome Project and things such as that. So can anyone tell me what that is in a few words? Anyone? If not, it's all the genetic material of an organism. So that entire DNA sequence and all of the genes and chromosomes and everything that goes into that. So hereditary, which I said we'd get to again. I'm sure all of you have heard this term also. Some of these are a little more simple. But does anyone want to give me a pretty straightforward example, or not example, but definition of what hereditary means? Or how it would be relevant to this class today?
What gets passed down.
Exactly. So it's inherited. It's passed down from parent to child. So this will include traits such as hair, eye color, which are just phenotypic, or particular genes of DNA variants. Some diseases are also inherited, which relates to the biomedicine topic that we'll be exploring today. So the environment. This is you would think it's a pretty straightforward term, but in the subject of anthropology, it plays a lot of different roles. So when you think of environment, what are some things you guys think about? Like trees, rivers, stuff like that. But here, we'd be talking about all non-genetic factors that influence the development of traits and of individuals. So nutrition plays into your environment. Physical stress, psychological stress, all those things are your environment. But it is also the physical area where you live, and individuals live in those places and they adapt over time. So as Kate mentioned before, we'll be exploring these ideas of white people get skin cancer more easily than people who are not white, and people of African descent are more likely to have sickle cell anemia. And both of these have to do with the environments in which these individuals or groups of individuals are found, or tend to be found. So epigenetics. This is another kind of complicated term. I'm sure we've all heard about it, but I'm not sure everyone has an exact definition for what it would be. But if anyone has one to offer for me, yeah?
It's heritable gene, heritage control, which is not based on DNA sequence.
Right. So basically, it's turning off and turning on genes, so regulating genes in a way that changes how they work and how they're expressed, but it does not change the DNA sequence itself. So it's become a hot topic in biomedicine because of how epigenetics can relate to certain diseases such as cancer. So now we have microbiome, which this is a term I'm sure someone's familiar with. Yes?
It's the total of the microorganisms that live in and on the body.
Yes. So our audience member said it's all the microorganisms that live inside and on the body. So that's basically what it is. It begins accumulating when you're born through the birth canal, which is one interesting thing. I've heard that if you're born by cesarean section, they'll actually rub some of the material from the birth canal onto the newborn baby to get all those microorganisms and bacteria that help with building immunity and against infection and helping with digestion, other things like that. So most of your body is made up of bacteria, which freaks some people out, but I'm sure we're all familiar with that by now. So now we have three terms that are related in a way that gets them kind of mixed up. So we have ancestry, and then we'll be talking about race and ethnicity. So to keep us from confusing one another, I'll just go through these next three so that we know. These are the three that will come up throughout the panel, throughout the rest of the night. So to make sure you get these very clear, I'll spend a little extra time on them. So ancestry is a person's family background or genealogy. So in genetics, it's the particular alleles, or the gene variants that we saw earlier, that an individual received from each of his or her ancestors. So as you can see, if you had one African parent and one European parent, you'd have African ancestry for some of your genes and European ancestry for some of your other genes. So this is really important to keep in mind for the discussion we'll be having later. Whereas race is a little different from this. So race is thought of as one of the groups that into which people can be divided based on certain physical qualities. So if you think of races such as white, black, all these other, like Chinese, you can think of those are mainly physical qualities that, as we've heard before, as we're going to hear later, have little to no biological significance. And then here comes ethnicity, which is one of those tricky terms that you see pop up everywhere. But the definition we'll be using tonight is an ethnic group or ethnicity is a category of people who identify with one another based on similarities such as common language, ancestry, which we talked about, social or cultural groups, or national experiences. So it's important to keep those three separate. Hopefully you got a chance to jot those down. So now we have something, if anyone was here for last week's talk, you have an upper hand here. So can anyone define phrenology for me? It's kind of a fun word. Yeah, go ahead.
The sort of disproved science of identifying a person's physical and personality characteristics by bumps on their skull.
Yeah, you're good. You should do this. So phrenology is the study of the size and shape of a person's skull, used to determine a person's character and mental abilities. So it's based on this idea that certain parts of the brain, which you can study from cranial shape and size, are associated with certain mental traits. if you guys were here last week, you would have heard it was begun by a German scientist by the name of Gall, I believe, and he was looking at the minds of criminals to try to understand them more. And it was disproved in the mid-1800s, but in the early 1800s it was very popular, and today we know it's not true. I don't know if we have that one today, but let's move on. Bias. This is a term I think everyone is familiar with. It's something I'm sure everyone has admitted they have within them. So it's a prejudice. It's a preconceived notion that tends to result in unfair treatment of certain parties, whether that be better treatment for others or worse treatment for the opposite side. So now social identity. This has a lot of different factors that play into it. So does anyone have anything that they would say is one of their social identity markers? So like for me, I'm a student, so that's one social identity marker. For some of you, you could be professionals in your workplace. So it's a person's sense of who they are based on the groups to which you belong. So that's pretty straightforward. It could be you identify with a certain race, you identify with a certain ethnicity, anything like that. And so here are two terms that are going to be opposites again. So we have polygenesis. Does anyone know what this term is? I believe this was mentioned last week as well, if anyone was here. But I'm sure you could take a guess if you have any Greek or Latin background. Oh, yeah.
The idea that each race was created separately.
Yes, exactly. So it's this idea that different races evolved separately from pre-human ancestors. So that was each race technically is a different species. This was proved wrong, and now we look in favor of monogenesis, which, as you can guess from the opposite of polygenesis, is the idea that all humans evolved as a single species in the same from the same pre-human ancestors. So those are all the terms I think you'll need to get by today. As I said before, they should be posted onto the Penn Museum Classroom website when you get home, and you'll be able to download those, look over them again.